On April 29, 1945, American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division entered the Dachau concentration camp and were confronted with a picture that changed them forever. 40 wagons filled to the brim with the naked bodies of emaciated people. Mountains of bodies decomposed in the sun. Thousands of dying prisoners who looked like living skeletons. The smell of death, which is impossible to forget. At that moment, something broke in the liberators' souls. Battle-hardened soldiers who traveled across Europe saw something that surpassed all possible limits of human cruelty. And they broke down. What happened next went down in history as the Dachau massacre, the day when the US military shot dozens of German guards, even those who tried to surrender. General Patton personally ordered the investigation to be closed, admitting that the soldiers were in a state of shock after seeing the horrors. The case file was classified for 46 years. But what exactly happened there? How many people were actually killed? And can this revenge be justified? That's what we're going to talk about today. Dachau was founded in March 1933 and became the first regular concentration camp established by the Nazi regime. Located just 16 kilometers northwest of Munich, on the site of a former ammunition factory, this camp became a sinister training ground where the Nazis practiced a human extermination system that was then extended throughout occupied Europe. Dachau was not just one of many concentration camps, it was a matrix, a model for the whole system. It was here that the future commandants and guards of other death camps were trained. It was here that methods of psychological and physical destruction of prisoners were developed. Theodor Eicke, the second commandant of Dachau, created a strict system of rules, punishments and bullying, which was subsequently implemented in all concentration camps of the Third Reich. More than 200,000 people passed through this camp between 1933 and 1945. Initially, political opponents of the regime were sent here, communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Then the number of categories of enemies expanded. Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, homosexuals, criminal offenders, and prisoners of war of various nationalities were held in Dachau. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, the number of Jews in the camp increased dramatically. More than 10,000 Jewish men were sent there. Dachau became a place of monstrous medical experiments. Prisoners were forcibly placed in pressure chambers to study the effects of high-altitude conditions on the body, immersed in ice water to study hypothermia, infected with malaria and tuberculosis to test drugs. These so-called experiments were conducted without any anesthesia and often ended in the painful death of the subjects. Nazi doctors viewed prisoners not as human beings, but as expendable material for their research. The death toll in Dachau between January 1940 and May 1945 was at least 28,000, to which should be added the victims from 1933 to 1939. However, the true death toll, according to researchers, is much higher. Many deaths were not documented, especially in the last months of the war, when the camp was in complete chaos. The spring of 1945 was a time of maximum terror for the prisoners of Dachau. As the Allied forces advanced, the Nazis evacuated the eastern camps, transporting prisoners to the west on foot, in so-called death marches. Thousands of people, already exhausted to the limit, were driven along snow-covered roads without food, water and the opportunity to stop for rest. Stragglers were shot on the spot. Many died of cold, hunger, and disease right on the road. More than 1,600 prisoners were now crammed into barracks designed for 200 people. Sanitary conditions have become catastrophic. A typhus epidemic began in the camp, which claimed 100 to 200 lives every day. Medical care was practically non-existent. People were piled up because the crematorium did not physically have time to burn them. The stinking smell of decomposing flesh hung over the entire camp. By the end of April, the situation had reached its peak. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler sent a telegram to the commandant of Dachau ordering the evacuation of the camp and, if impossible, the liquidation of all prisoners. The Nazis did not want to leave living witnesses to their crimes. But the time for carrying out this monstrous plan has already expired. On April 28, 1945, an underground organization of prisoners led by Walter Neff and Georg Scherer staged an uprising, thwarting a plan to destroy the remaining prisoners. The underground seized control of key points of the camp and arrested several capo guards from among the prisoners who worked for the administration. Some of them were hanged right in the camp as retribution for years of betrayal and brutality. On the night of April 28 to 29, most of the guards fled the camp. The elite SS men from the SS Totenkopfverbände, special units specializing in the protection of concentration camps, left their posts, realizing that the hour of reckoning was approaching. Martin Weiss, the last commandant of Dachau, escaped with him. However, his escape did not help him escape justice. After the war, he was caught and executed for war crimes. SS men remained in the camp, who themselves were in disciplinary prison for various offenses against the SS order. Along with them were soldiers from the Hungarian 26th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS and a group of wounded Wehrmacht soldiers stationed in the camp hospital. Probably, there simply wasn't enough transport to evacuate everyone, and these people were abandoned to their fate. The morning of April 29, 1945, began as an ordinary offensive day for American soldiers. The 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division of the United States advanced through Bavaria, overcoming sniper ambushes and resistance from scattered German units. At about 11 a.m., they approached the western gate of a fenced-off complex. The soldiers knew that this was a concentration camp, but they had no idea what exactly awaited them. The first thing they saw was the death train, a train of 40 railroad cars parked at the west gate. What was inside surpassed all possible nightmares. The carriages were packed with naked bodies of people, thousands of bodies stacked on top of each other like firewood. All the dead were extremely emaciated, skin and bones, literally walking skeletons. Some of the bodies still bore signs of severe beatings and torture. As one of the American soldiers recalled, it was the most terrible sight in his entire life. Battle-hardened veterans who had passed through North Africa, Sicily and France were sick of what they saw. Some soldiers slid to the ground and began to fight in hysterics. Others just stood there in a daze, unable to take their eyes off this apocalyptic sight. Many were crying, grown-up, seasoned men who thought they had already seen everything the war had to offer. At that moment, a group of 4 SS men with a white flag approached the Americans from the opposite end of the train. They intended to surrender, but they chose the worst possible time for this. The soldiers, who had just seen the results of the SS's work, were not in the mood for negotiations. Lieutenant Walsh ordered the SS men to climb into one of the wagons with the corpses. When they obeyed, he shot all 4 of them with his pistol. None of the Americans tried to stop him. At 11:20 a.m., the first American units entered the camp. There are several versions of how the official surrender took place. According to one of the popular versions described by former prisoner Enna Gunn, SS Obersturmführer Heinrich Skojenski came out to meet the Americans in an impeccable SS uniform and highly polished boots. He snapped her attention and shouted, "Heil Hitler!" The contrast between his dapper appearance and the dirty, unshaven American officers, exhausted from days of continuous fighting, was so striking that they became enraged. An American officer spat in Skojenski's face and shot him in the head, shouting "Swineherd." However, this dramatic story is disputed by professional historians. The fact is that the surrender process was captured by numerous American war correspondents, and the photographs show a completely different person. His identity was reliably established as SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker, the eldest of the remaining officers in the camp. Wicker arrived in Dachau only in early April 1945, along with a group of prisoners who were being driven on foot from another camp. In mid-April, he also led one of the death marches, when 1,700 prisoners from the auxiliary camp Hessenthal were sent on foot to Dachau. Many did not make it, dying of exhaustion on the way. Wicker is present in several photographs taken in different parts of the camp during the day of April 29th, which means that he remained alive for at least several hours after the Americans arrived. However, he was not in Dachau city prison, where all the surviving German prisoners were placed. Officially, Wicker was listed as missing. According to the testimony of 2 surviving German guards, Wicker was killed by one of the American soldiers during the first day, although the exact circumstances of his death remained unknown. Around noon, American soldiers began sorting out the captured. One column was made up of SS men, the other was made up of Wehrmacht soldiers mostly wounded from the hospital and medical personnel. At about the same time, another group of American soldiers entered the camp through another gate. Suddenly, gunfire rang out. The fire was conducted by several SS men, about 5 to 6 people who were holed up in one of the security towers. A short firefight ensued. The tower was quickly captured. The surviving SS men were dragged out of the tower and shot right at its foot. No attempts were made to capture them. The selected SS men, about 70 people, were taken to the camp's coal yard. Along the way, several people were killed under unclear circumstances. Even a special investigation conducted later could not establish who exactly shot them and why. Witnesses gave contradictory testimony, and some refused to talk about what happened at all. In the coal yard, the prisoners were placed against the wall at gunpoint. The machine gunner was an Indian named Birdseye. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, left the soldiers under guard and went off to do other things. As soon as he was out of sight, a long burst of machine gun fire rang out. Hearing the gunfire, Sparks rushed back to the coal yard. What he saw shocked even him. The machine gunner continued to shoot hysterically at the people who had already fallen. Sparks pulled out his pistol and fired several shots into the air to stop the carnage. The machine gunner finally stopped firing. He sobbed, convulsed, and screamed that the prisoners were trying to escape. He was taken away, and another shooter with stronger nerves was put in his place. As a result of this incident, 17 people were killed and several others were injured. Sparks ordered medical treatment for the wounded and strictly forbade any further shootings. But control over the situation was already partially lost. After Sparks' next departure, a group of released prisoners armed with shovels, batons and picks came to the coal yard. They started beating up some of the SS men. The reaction of the American soldiers was mixed. Some tried to stop the massacre by driving away former prisoners. Others turned away and pretended not to notice anything. As indicated in the materials of the American military investigation, some of the soldiers deliberately did not interfere in what was happening, believing that the prisoners had the right to take revenge on their tormentors. By the evening of April 29th, the main units of the liberators had left Dachau, moving on towards Munich. They were replaced by a guard company, and engineering units arrived. All the prisoners were sent back to the barracks. A typhus epidemic was raging in the camp, and the American command immediately declared quarantine, closing the camp for entry and exit. The first night after liberation became one of the bloodiest in the history of Dachau. According to various estimates, about 300 prisoners died that night. Some of them were killed by other prisoners for collaborating with the German administration. During the 12 years of the camp's existence, a group of collaborators, capos and elders, stood out among the prisoners, who, for certain privileges, helped the SS maintain order, often showing cruelty no less than the Germans themselves. Now it's payback time. The rest of those who died that night died of illness and exhaustion. The organisms of people who had been living on the brink of survival for months and years could not stand it after eating. According to Nair and Gunn, several prisoners died from overeating. Having gained access to American rations, they ate too much after prolonged starvation, and their bodies could not cope with such a load. The next morning, the Americans organized a forced visit to the camp for local residents. German citizens were escorted from the surrounding settlements and forced to participate in unloading the bodies from the death train. Several large trenches, mass graves, were dug by bulldozers near the camp, in which thousands of dead prisoners were buried. Some of the bodies were buried in the cemetery of Lutenberg. Moreover, the columns with the bodies were specially driven through the center of Dachau so that the locals could see with their own eyes what was happening in the camp, located just a few kilometers from their homes. Many Germans claimed they knew nothing about the atrocities. Now they had to face the truth. In 1945, Orthodox Easter fell on May 6th. The camp was still under quarantine due to the typhus epidemic, and movement was severely restricted. However, among the released prisoners there were 18 Orthodox clergy, Serbs, Russians and Greeks. All these years, they have secretly maintained their faith, despite the prohibitions and the risk of severe punishment. The priests appealed to the American command with a request to allow the Easter service to be held. Permission was granted, and they were given a separate room. They asked for vestments, candles, icons and other church utensils to be obtained through the Americans who were traveling to Munich. However, due to the confusion in the city, the battle for Munich was not yet fully over. The messengers were unable to contact any of the local Orthodox parishes. Then the priests showed ingenuity. They made makeshift robes out of hospital towels. The crosses were made from improvised materials. The Americans found candles. There were no icons, but that didn't stop the service. Orthodox Easter was celebrated within the walls of the Dachau concentration camp with the participation of hundreds of prisoners. As one of the witnesses of this event later recalled, in the centuries-old history of the Orthodox Church, perhaps, there has never been a more unusual and touching Easter service. Priests in makeshift vestments, who had passed through the hell of the Nazi camps, and their flock, emaciated, sick people who miraculously survived, sang together "Christ is risen," in a building where death reigned a few days ago. Despite the release, quarantine, and efforts of American military doctors, the typhus epidemic remained unchecked for a long time. The disease continued to kill the released prisoners at a terrifying rate. In May 1945, after the end of the war in Europe, more than 2,000 people died of typhus. In June, the epidemic finally began to subside. During this month, 196 people died. Slowly, gradually, the American doctors managed to stabilize the situation. Former prisoners received enhanced nutrition, medical care, and sanitary measures were organized. The camp turned into an open-air hospital. It was only in the middle of the summer of 1945, 2.5 months after the liberation and more than 2 months after the end of the war, that all Dachau prisoners finally had the opportunity to leave the camp. As noted by eyewitnesses, many former prisoners were afraid to leave. After spending so many years in captivity, the outside world seemed frightening and unfamiliar to them. Some continued to live in barracks until the end of the summer, gradually getting used to the idea of freedom. In May 1945, the command of the American Army initiated an investigation into incidents related to the mistreatment of German prisoners of war during the liberation of Dachau. On June 8, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whittaker presented a report titled Investigation into Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau, also known as the IG report. The investigation revealed that about 50 SS men and other Dachau workers were killed on the day of the camp's liberation. Of these, approximately 10 to 12 people were killed by former prisoners in acts of revenge, and the rest were shot by American soldiers. Throughout his life, Lieutenant Colonel Sparks insisted on a lower figure. He claimed that his soldiers shot no more than 30 people. Sparks also emphasized that a significant part of the captured SS men was safely transported to Dachau City Prison. This party of prisoners was accompanied by Lieutenant Walsh, the one who shot 4 SS men at the death train in Chaplain Low. Thus, not all the prisoners were killed, many survived and subsequently stood trial. For obvious reasons, the concentration camp guards preferred not to talk about their service in Dachau after the war. However, at least 3 survivors are known, 2 SS men and 1 medical worker. Another survivor, Hans Lindberger, even left a short memoir about the events of April 29, in which he confirmed Sparks' testimony. Lindberger was in the same group of SS men in the coal yard that the Birdseye machine gunner opened fire on, but miraculously survived and was not even wounded. Although the investigation identified almost all the American soldiers who took part in the executions of prisoners, General George Patton, the legendary commander of the U.S. Third Army, known for his harshness and directness, ordered the case to be closed. In his order, he referred to the difficult psychological state of the soldiers, who saw horrific images of the mass destruction of people during the liberation of the camp. The investigation materials were classified for 46 years. They were declassified only in 1991-1992, after the publication of the sensational book The Avenger Hour by former military medic Howard Buckner in 1986. Buckner, who participated in the liberation of Dachau, claimed in his book that American soldiers executed every single German and Hungarian in the camp that day. Allegedly about 560 people, plus 40 more, were killed by former prisoners. After the declassification of the investigation materials, it became clear that Buckner greatly exaggerated the scale of the massacre. The true number of people killed was about 50 to 80, not 600. However, Buckner's book played an important role. It was the public outcry around it that forced the US authorities to declassify the documents and reveal the truth about the events of April 29, 1945.